أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome back to week 2 of our series on taking care of yourself. My name is Yasmin Toor and you are watching the Islamic Reflections channel. So for those of you who joined us in the last session, which was 2 weeks ago, and apologies for not being able to make it to the live session last week. We did look at what self-care basically is, why it is necessary from a Islamic perspective as well as a general perspective. So this week we are going to do a little assessment on recognizing whether or not you need to take care of yourself. And obviously, before you can implement any techniques or any measures or steps to take care of yourself, nurture yourself to be the best version of yourself, you actually need to know in which areas you're lacking. So there are a couple of red flags or a couple of warning signs that you can look out for that will tell you that you are exerting yourself beyond capacity. And if you do this self-assessment and look at your daily routine, how you take on your tasks, how your relationship with other people is, how your performance at work is. If you look at a couple of parameters, a couple of common warning signs, you can easily identify whether or not you are heading towards burnout. And burnout is one of the main reasons that people start to suffer from several mental as well as physical illnesses and ailments. So the key is to avoid heading towards that direction. So you can only do that if you regularly take care of yourself, and you need to know where you need to step in. So we will look at the signs one by one, at the symptoms, and at the end of the session, if you analyze yourself, if you look at yourself and how your life is going, and you are suffering from two or more than any of these symptoms, then it might be a sign that you are seriously lacking in self-care. And you need to take a step back and figure out how to recharge and re-energize yourself before you can be the best version of yourself for other people and your surroundings. So the first sign to look for is a physical and emotional exhaustion. So if you are in a state of stress all the time, if you feel a lack of energy all the time, if you feel tired without reason, there's no apparent illness, but you feel tired, you don't have the energy to do your daily tasks, you feel drained, you feel depleted, and if there are a couple of tasks that you need to do during the day, you may feel fear or dread or anxiety to actually take on that task because you are so exhausted. Exhaustion due to a illness or maybe due to certain medication, that is an entirely different issue. But if there is no apparent cause and you feel drained all the time and you are not being yourself all the time, or if, for example, if small little signs as difficulty getting out of bed in the morning despite having had a good night's sleep, dreading to get out of bed, dreading to take on the day, These are signs of a physical and emotional exhaustion. So it could be one of the signs that you are actually draining yourself. So, sign number two is unexplained physical symptoms. Like if you look at yourself and you suffer from headaches quite a lot, despite being no actual diagnosis, if you have a lot of migraines, or if you have a lot of tummy issues, or if you have, stress, pain, general physical body fatigue, then that could be a sign that you are under constant stress, right? So that constant stress can manifest itself in the form of physical symptoms, which you need to look out for. Many people tend to mistake these symptoms as some sort of onset of illness, and they link it with unnecessary medication. But actually, the cause is not an actual disease. It's the stress that is affecting your body. You can also, in general, you can see the stress, the effect that stress has on one's body. For example, let's suppose that you have a really important presentation and you're really anxious. Many of you might experience a bad tummy, you know. So stress, the production of the stress hormone, actually directly triggers certain physical symptoms in our body. So if you're going through continuous stress all the time, if you are draining yourself all the time, those physical symptoms might develop a continuous recurring pattern, and you might have recurring physical symptoms. So this is also one thing to look out for when you are assessing yourself in terms of your energy levels and your mental, spiritual, and physical well being. So sometimes you experience an overwhelming sense of dread or fear. For example, sometimes it's not always physical work that's draining you. It could also be mental, spiritual. For example, if you're stuck in a job that you actually don't love, it subconsciously adds towards stress. And you dread going to work, you feel that life is not in your control, and this feeling of lack of control or an imbalance in your work life situation, or maybe lack of support from your friends, family, and social circles, these things can contribute to chronic stress. And then that chronic stress can also lead to burnout. Sign number four that you need to look at is feeling a sense of detachment from your surroundings, or feeling, dark and negative and cynical all the time. You know, we as humans, we need constant little triggers in order to be happy. Like little things, for example, eating your favorite flavor of ice cream might bring you instant happiness. But if you feel that things that you used to find joy in doing don't bring you that kind of joy anymore, if you feel detached from your environment or the people around you, if you cannot relate to people around you, or if you continuously tend to talk negative with yourself, it might actually be talking, as some people actually speak to themselves. It could also be negative thoughts within your mind. Um, these things are a sign that you are heading towards major anxiety and depression, and that you are draining yourself in a way that you shouldn't be. if you are pessimistic about everything, if there are things that could have positive outcomes and you fail to see them, if you fail to see the positive things around you in your life, if all you see and all you focus on are the negative things, the problems, the dark stuff, that is one sign that you might be stressing yourself out beyond your capacity. So, number five is sudden erratic emotions like anger, mostly anger. If you find yourself being cranky often, if you find yourself being annoyed at other people, even though they don't even give you a genuine reason of being annoyed. Like somebody could just ask you a simple question and you might, lose yourself and, start shouting at them. Or with working mothers, or even with mothers who are actively taking part in, community activities, and at the same time balancing family and relatives and the kids and the house, everything, those mothers might take out that kind of anger on their children, um, being angry or shouting at children for nothing, taking out your anger and frustration on your children or on your spouse or the other members of the family who are living with you. So angry outbursts like that, interpersonal tension, being irritable all the time, like you feel irritated at little things. You're always, you're on the edge, always on the edge. That is also one sign that you are draining yourself. So the sixth sign to look for is your concentration span. Concentration span is um, the time that you need to concentrate when you are doing a particular task. If you have trouble concentrating, if you have trouble focusing on things, if you have poor concentrations, some people who might have been able to multitask in the past, if they suddenly lose their ability to multitask and find themselves being stuck on a single task for a really long time without being actually able to accomplish something, that results into a lower rate of productivity. That is also a sign that you are being overworked or that you are draining yourself. And number seven is your lack of sleep. If you find trouble falling asleep, despite being physically exhausted, like sometimes it can happen on and off, maybe a couple of times a month. But if you feel yourself constantly having trouble falling asleep despite being really tired, but your brain, it's just an overkill, it won't stop, or it doesn't relax, it doesn't slow down, that also means that your brain is actually overloaded with tasks and thoughts and issues and stuff that is overburdening you, and that manifests into disrupting your sleep wake cycle. So this is also one sign that you are draining yourself. So these are all symptoms, if we look at it from a worldly perspective. But since we are Muslims and we believe that everything has a connection to our religion, it is also necessary to recognize how lack of certain elements in your faith can lead to draining yourself. So, all these symptoms, although they have a physical, they have a scientific, they have a rational explanation, these symptoms actually come from weakness in faith. So, not feeling content with things, worrying about things that are not in your control. It comes from not actually believing that everything happens for a reason. So, if your connection with Allah is not as strong as it should be, all these symptoms can manifest even more strongly. And it is also a major cause of restlessness. and a constant state of the mind being under pressure and under anxiety. So, if your daily routine does not include, you have to assess yourself. If your daily routine does not allocate sufficient time to strengthen your bond with your faith, strengthen your bond with your Lord, doing things that actually bring peace to the mind and the soul and the physical being, if you're not allocating enough time towards that, the lack of that dedication, let's say, can also be a major trigger that will eventually lead you to feel drained, feel all these symptoms. You will feel restless. You will feel your patience, you know, shrinking. You will feel your art of speech changing. The choice of your words will automatically shift towards a harsher side instead of being softer. You will find communicating with people more difficult, focusing on other people's ideas, getting your ideas across to other people. It becomes difficult as a result of all these seven symptoms. And it has a deep connection with actually staying on the right path. So if you have, let's say, two or more of these symptoms, if you assess yourself, it is really important to, sit back once in a while. We all know that daily routine, responsibilities, jobs, relationships, family, community, illnesses, and all those trials and tribulations that we face can lead to not sitting down, not reflecting, not actually analyzing the kind of days we are spending, how we are allocating our time towards different tasks and activities. But it is really important that each and every one of us sits down at least once in a while, maybe once or twice a month, if not every day. Successful people, they do this every day. Content people, they do this every day. Probably the best time to do it is before going to sleep, to reflect on your day, how you allocated different time slots, and how your symptoms may or may have not improved from the previous day or the previous week. Some people do it on a weekly basis. People who are not at all aware of self care and how important it is to nurture yourself, they rarely sit down and reflect. They just keep going in a never ending circle. And then when these symptoms start to kick in, they wonder if there's something wrong with their health, if there's a disease, if they caught a bug or an infection, or if there's something wrong with their brain, and they start taking medication, which is not at all necessary. It's so much lies in our own hands. So much of our commitments that are suffering are due to neglecting all these red flags. And I can say with great certainty that each and every one of us, we have experienced one or two or even more of these symptoms or red flags in our lives or during certain phases of our lives, especially the young generation. We tend to get irritated so easily, and we have routines that disrupt our sleep wake cycles and all these things. So it's really important to sit back and assess. It's not always very visible at first because these signs kick in slowly. They magnify themselves really slowly. We tend to overfocus on symptoms and we do not look at the root of the cause. So it is difficult. but not impossible. These symptoms are related to one another, they overlap. You might not feel cynical, but you might feel unhealthy, or you are unhappy. You might feel overwhelmed, or you have, no time for fun, or even if you're having fun, you don't actually recognize it as fun. You you can't explore your full potential. Sometimes the being cynical part does not only project onto other people, but we are cynical for our own selves. We are overly critical. We have weak self acceptance. We don't have self compassion. We judge ourselves, which we should do, but as you know, excess of everything is bad. So, um, and the same thing happens with body image. You might have trouble accepting yourself. You might have trouble settling in your social circle, or you obsess over things. Like all these things are interrelated. So, usually, when you're heading towards burnout and when you are consistently neglecting your self care, and when you're consistently not taking out time to nurture yourself and replenish your energy, a combination of all these symptoms that we just talked about, they come into place. So some people may also have issues with um, identifying what they want in life, what path they want to follow, what career they want to take, self-expression, talents. Some people might put pressure on themselves unnecessary pressure on themselves, and they fail to recognize that they are achieving, but instead they drive themselves over the edge trying to overachieve. So all these things contribute towards draining our own pot of potential. So as we talked about it in the last session, our vessel needs to be appropriately filled at all times. Obviously, it's impossible to keep it full to the brim. Your energy is bound to um, decline, it is bound to go up and down, but the key is to maintain a healthy level of energy within yourself, to keep your vessel filled to an extent that even if you give out to other vessels, there is always something back left in you that you can use to replenish yourself. So these things are really important. So for all of you who are listening to this, those who will watch the recording afterwards, I urge you to sit down and analyze yourself. And for some of you, it might be difficult to reflect on the past and draw a conclusion based on the past week or your past month. You might lack the overview. If you can do it based on your past couple of days or couple of months, or even for your past year, this is good. But if you can't, make a resolution to look out for these warning signs and red flags in the next couple of days or weeks in order to be able to arrive at a conclusion, and in order to be able to identify whether or not some or even all of these symptoms are with you. So only after we identify the symptoms, actually acknowledge the presence of these symptoms, because one thing is also a stigma. that people don't tend to want to recognize that they are overworking themselves or draining themselves. They take it as a sign of weakness, acknowledging that they need time for themselves. But it's not a sign of weakness. It's your right. It's your duty. So, in order to give yourself that right, in order to fulfill your duty towards yourself, in order to be able to take care of the body and the soul that Allah has blessed you with, you need to identify and you need to recognize where you are at. And without that recognition, there is no treatment. And you can treat yourself after you have identified it. So it's really easy. It just takes admitting and then reflecting. So do the assessment, reflect, look back or look forward, all these warning signs and red flags. And in the upcoming sessions, inshallah, over the subsequent weeks, we will address on how to um, fight against these symptoms, how to actually take our time, how to make adjustments or changes to your routine, to your work life balance. And there are a couple of exercises that we will discuss that you can do. But first and foremost, the self assessment is really necessary. So I hope with today's session, you now know what you need to look for, how to identify those red flags, and then inshallah, you will join me next week and we look at real practical ways to cultivate and grow self love, self care. Because after today's assessment, we will know where we are lacking and how we are lacking. So I hope that you gain something beneficial from the session today. If there are any questions, concerns, you can leave it in the comments and I will try to answer each and every one of you, inshallah. Until the next week, I leave you all in the care of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.